Okay, guys, we're going to go ahead and get started. There is a sign-in sheet circulating. Please make sure you sign that before you leave. And I am going to turn things over to Dr. John Kirtley for the law review.
All right, guys, who's ready for a test? That's time. Let's go. Let's get this over with. This turning point, that'd be way too easy. So for any of you that take notes, first thing you need to write down is most boring lecture ever. This is, while I generally enjoy doing lectures, this one is not necessarily fun, entertaining, and it's rough, but we're going to speed through this. Just so that you guys know, I mean, I think most of you have seen me before. I'm John Kirtley. I'm the director of the Board of Pharmacy. I'm a licensed pharmacist. I graduated here from UMS College of Pharmacy 20 years ago now, which I actually had gray hair then, just not quite this much. It's always entertaining to see how different the school is. Like, they won't let me in the building now. I have to call Dr. O'Brien or somebody to let me in. And then I don't know if I'm supposed to have a mask or not. So it's the sign of the times. What I'm going to do for you today is, for all three of the campuses, I've got both UMS and Harding on here, I'm going to basically take a walk through the law book, and I'm going to really try to concentrate on things of as much, if nothing else, telling you don't worry about this section, don't worry about that. There's some things, and I'll say this for the benefit not just of the students here today, but also for people we have that are going to be watching this video preparing for reciprocity tests, or for you guys when you go to other states. There's some things that other states routinely do that we do not do at all. And examples of that would be like, you may go to another state, and a lot of times on MPJE tests, they may have questions like, what is the makeup of the board? How many members are there? What are their qualifications? What are expiration dates? Like, we do not ask you that stuff, so you do not have to study that for us. So as we dive in, most of you have seen our board website before. I've skipped straight into the pharmacy law book section. I'm going to show you some related documents that are connected through here that are important, especially given some changes in the last couple of years. And at the end, we're going to have some time for questions. Just so that you know, and it's the same for whether you're doing reciprocity testing in the future or anything else, we don't answer questions during the test. Just like if you take MPJ for another test, for another state, just like if you take NAPLEX, like, you don't get to go, hey, were you really intending to ask me about such and such in this question or not? Like, the people in the testing centers have no idea about this. This is a pass or fail test. The other thing that I can tell you is, if you're in our office taking it, you would wait in a chair while we grade it. For you guys at the three schools, we plan to have one of our staff members at each campus, and we will take your test. It'll be Scantron. It's 76 questions. Right now, that may change slightly, but it'll be somewhere around that number of questions. And we will get it back to our office, and we will have you put your phone number on the test, and I will call, or someone on my staff will call you if you fail the test. Knock on wood. I hope not to call anybody. But once we have made all necessary phone calls and have made that contact, we will send a notice to the college that all necessary phone calls have been made. So if you did not get a call, it means you passed. So, and I cannot predict what my phone number looks like. It's a state phone number. Some phones show it as Board of Pharmacy. Some may think it is some sort of spam. I actually had a call yesterday that I had to set it was for the robo spam blocker to actually let me through on the call. I was like, I don't know how they know who I am either, but I guess if a real voice tells them something, they let the call proceed. So, in the law book, when you look at this, the law book is set up into two completely separate sections. And this whole top half, I mean, you can look at the entire law book, or you can go one rule at a time, which is the way I'm going to do this today. Get a little bit of feedback on one of the mics. The statutes are all state laws. Those are things that were either passed by the General Assembly through the legislative process, or something that was done by like an initiated act of the public. There's very little of that would be effective specifically for pharmacy. But in what I generally say is most statutes, save a few things, there's some very specific things in statutes that you might want to pay attention to, like what the ages are and who can give certain immunizations. But almost everything else that's in the statute is restated in the rules more specifically. Like you could have a statute that's fairly generalized, like a pharmacist can do point of care test and treat, and then we have a rule that sets out more specifics to that that's actually an easier read. So I usually don't go through all the statutes. You can read it. The Pharmacy Practice Act itself is what allows the Board of Pharmacy to exist, establishes the licensure of you as pharmacist or as intern or registration as technicians, the ability for businesses, the scope of practice you have. It's very interesting in that anytime you are dealing with a profession of whatever type, medical, whether you're talking about pharmacy, physician, nurse, generally the Pharmacy Practice Act, the Medical Practice Act, it sets up your ability to exist as a profession and defines what scope of practice, what you can actually do. Below the statutes, pharmacy rules and regs. So in this, and let me see, I'm going to blow this up a little bit more. That may be too much. I'll try not to make you dizzy as I scroll. If you get nauseated, like on a 4D ride, just close your eyes for a minute, let the room settle. That was funny. Come on, guys. All right, description of the board. Once again, we are not going to ask you about the description of the board. I'm not going to ask you about your location for the board offices, request for information. It is always worth noticing, we talk about licensees governed by the board, that is where the scope of the Board of Pharmacy actually is. There are a lot of things that affect you as a pharmacist, such as what scope a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant or a physician have, and I'm going to show you a chart, so if I forget to pull it up, y'all remind me, that will help delineate that, because otherwise you have to go look at all this kind of information in every one of those professions, and we've got a chart on our website that helps with that a great deal. There's some things that are important for you specifically in that, you have an intern license. It expires 6 months after you graduate. If you wait to take NAPLEX, if you fail NAPLEX and it's been more than 6 months, I do not have any legal option to extend that permit. You can go back and become a pharmacy technician. So you could have a doctor of pharmacy degree, not have passed NAPLEX for more than 6 months, and wind up being a pharmacy technician, which is why we tell people to take the NAPLEX early rather than often. Nobody? Come on, folks. All right. I'm not going to ask you dates. I'm not going to ask you about meeting requirements. I'm not going to ask you any types of numbers on fees. The things that are important in here is just understanding how it operates, and for your own knowledge, how you do have to have a license to practice, how it does have an expiration date. It's clearly defined on that actual permit, whether it's a business permit or if it's a professional license for you individually. Declaratory orders are interesting. I've been there for 18 years almost. I've only had like one person ever demand a declaratory order, and they did not like how that ended. It basically demands an immediate hearing, and it makes it a final action in a hurry. Inspectors' warning notices are fascinating because if you are ever in a pharmacy and they get one, we don't give a lot of them out, but it's basically a call for you to take immediate corrective action, report it to the board. And that's all of Rule 1. It's not very long. Some of the others, much more in depth. So when we look at Rule 2 is kind of the all-encompassing rule for you as a licensed pharmacist. Rule 2 also encompasses a lot of your practice issues as an intern. So while you're in pharmacy school, while you're a student pharmacist. Rule 3 you see is about technicians. Rule 4 is more about the pharmacies themselves. So things that are absolutely important. Changes in employment. It amazes me how many times we try to reach out and find somebody and their employment is not correct on the Board of Pharmacy system. So if need be, I tell you generally as you are an incoming intern, if I have to call your home address from when you originally applied and talk to your mama to find you, we will do so. But if we are sending you correct information, just like updating your address, having your employment updated, we're going to send it to whatever address we have officially on record, and that is our official notice. And if it's something about a hearing, and you go, oh, I didn't get it because I didn't update my address, we're going to show we sent it to the address of record, and we'll have a hearing without you if you don't show up. It's not like people think, oh, well, if I don't show up for my speeding ticket, they're just going to postpone the hearing. No, we just go ahead with it. All Rights after inactivity is interesting if you decide to take a break from pharmacy and let your license lapse to get it back. Internships, clerkships, you can look at our hours, how we regulate it. Most important on this, though, is definitions. So especially if you are not just in Arkansas, but if you have friends from other states coming to Arkansas, let them know they're going to have an intern license. If you are going to do a rotation or work for a summer or something in another state, pay very good attention. Like Tennessee doesn't have a licensed intern. I don't know how all that works there specifically. It's just weird to me, but almost every other state does require you to have that. The other things that are very important about this are things like the definition of supervision. Supervision is a specifically defined term for pharmacists overseeing technicians and overseeing interns. If you don't have supervision, you're not working as an intern. At least you're not doing the practice of pharmacy as an intern. You may be doing research in the library. That's not an immediate intern duty. But if you are especially in some sort of registered facility, helping take care of patients, prepare prescriptions, anything like that, this absolutely applies. We only have a couple of pharmacies at any given time that are not a Class A pharmacy, because most of the time when somebody realizes they're not a Class A pharmacy, they freak out a little bit and try to take immediate corrective action. I seem to say that a lot in these lectures, so that they become one again. You've got to know how intern training goes. It's interesting to know not just how it goes for you, but how it's different for foreign pharmacy graduates. It's the only place we talk about needing to be a preceptor as defined by the Board of Pharmacy rather than the college in practice. Preceptors, which is really just for foreign pharmacy grads. Got to be in an accredited degree program. Here are the requirements for examinations. I'm not going to ask you on the test what size picture you have to have, but I will tell you anecdotally, I have seen some really crazy pictures that people use on applications. We're like, well, I don't know what X got chopped out of this, but that definitely was some sort of dance or wedding or something. We've had people cut apart IDs and try to send us the picture. I'm like, you needed your driver's license. So how did you cut the picture out of it to send to us? Unprofessional, dishonorable conduct. You know, this is, sometimes we've had lectures, we've had requests for lectures at different colleges in the past where it's, how do I not get in trouble with the Board of Pharmacy? And that's kind of a loaded question, but pretty much any type of order for a hearing that we're going to write in my office is going to have some aspect of unprofessional conduct. And this specifically defines some of the very specific things that are unprofessional conduct, which you need to know. And it becomes fascinating that when I look across with my colleagues from other states as well, you know, I've had a couple before tell me, I have no idea how someone got through pharmacy school and they didn't realize that violating the Uniform Controlled Substance Act or the United States Controlled Substance Act would be unprofessional conduct. Like, people get offended that you say, well, you are guilty of unprofessional conduct. I'm not unprofessional. Okay. Would you prefer the term felon? Is that less offensive? I don't know. I'd rather be called unprofessional than a felon, personally. So reading through these and understanding that these are very specifically laid out, and most states have this, will show you that it's important and fairly uniform. I love the end here. Fraud, dishonesty, whether or not it involves a practice of pharmacy. You know, it is odd. We've had people that were involved in other theft, convictions, fraud, something like that, and they've had the argument, well, I wasn't at work when I did that. It's like, well, I mean, I understand, but just because you didn't get drunk and run over somebody in the store you were working at doesn't mean you're not in trouble for getting drunk and running over somebody. CE. My Lord, I have heard more arguments about CE the last couple of years of people, well, CE wasn't available. There was COVID. Let me tell you, there was more free live CE available via computer in the last 2 or 3 years than I could have ever imagined in my life. And I can tell you that from being a pharmacist, having a wife that's a pharmacist. I've got a sister who's a pharmacist. Those are 2 people, not 1. A cousin, that's a 3rd person. we all have had more access to CE the last couple of years. I mean, during COVID, these have been the first years of my life where my wife has had more live CE early in the year than me. And I mean, it seems like about every other week. I don't know if she's doing it just to ignore me or something else. She's like, I'm doing a CE right now. Leave me alone. Okay. Get your CE. I do not want to write an order for my own wife. Our CE requirements are very straightforward. 30 hours, 12 live, 12 ACP accredited. We do accept some other CE from people such as AMA, PRA, Category 1. If you are going to a CE with some physicians that is interprofessional, if it meets that American Medical Association PRA Category 1, we would also accept it. But you have to know CE requirements. Dr. McCready and I were talking before I came over here, and we've had 2 more people. We've been in the middle of a CE audit since May, and people are acting shocked that they were responsible to have their CE. We've been chasing them for 6 months. We're like, okay, if you don't respond now, you will have a hearing in front of the board in February. What we generally do is you have to make up double what you missed and pay $100 per hour for every hour that you missed. And we had a couple of people that paid like $2,000 and had to get 40 hours of CE. Get your CE. Like, it's not hard at all to get, but they're mad at us. So go figure. These old dates are meaningless because they are all well in the past, and we've talked about doing a cleanup modification to this at some point. I thought we'd actually done part of it. We keep leaving it in there so people realize, no, those are the old requirements, not the new requirements. Technicians. This is a shorter rule, thankfully. Once again, supervision. The other thing that's interesting is pharmacy technician is a specifically defined term. We have people in all kinds of other professions. I think of, like, I've called my veterinarian's office before. It's like, if you'd like to talk to the pharmacy technician, and I just want to go bash my head against walls, like, they're not a pharmacy technician. They have no license or registration with the Board of Pharmacy. So they may be working on prescriptions in the veterinarian's office, but I think people think that's just a general term. I've had people that work for companies like, yeah, I'm a pharmacy technician now. I'm like, well, what are you doing? Well, I'm working in the photo center, but I'm going to be back in the pharmacy soon. I'm like, you do realize there's an application and a registration process for that. Have you sent your criminal background check forms into the Board of Pharmacy? Nope. Well, you're not one yet. Have to be one. Have to let us know if you're changing employment. The big things with pharmacy technicians, a lot of the same type of unprofessional conduct issues will apply to pharmacy technicians, because just because you're a technician doesn't mean you can commit fraud or murder or anything else and keep your permit. We have fascinating conversations about that rather consistently. The qualifications are very plain. We have had a lot of places over the years, not on the test, but just so that you know, especially in practice as a pharmacist later, or even as a student pharmacist now, a lot of people think they have to go to get some other educational program to be a pharmacy technician. You can do it on the job training after you have your high school diploma or GED equivalent and pass the background check. But a lot of people, it's almost predatory in my opinion, go and they'll sign up for a school and they'll get into $15,000 or $20,000 of debt for a 6 to 9 month program, and they're promised a job that pays them way more than most pharmacy technicians are making. And it's especially frustrating when they contact the Board of Pharmacy and they're mad that we haven't found them a job. I'm like, we are not an employment agency. Some people would argue we are the opposite of an employment agency. But it's something that you will run into in practice, where you might tell people, look, you can go do that if you want to for your own edification or for your own experience or anything else, but you do not have to do that, and you do not have to incur that type of debt. Most importantly, tasks, responsibilities, and duties of a pharmacy technician. This is what tells you what they can and cannot do. And I think that a lot of people get confused on, if I'm around and I'm a pharmacist, a technician can do anything I can do, which is not true, versus I am around as the pharmacist and I'm responsible to supervise what they do. I say eyesight, earshot is what I would generally say. So we have people that want to get in these really ticky conversations about, well, it says a technician can place, pack, pour, put in a container for dispensing, whatever. Why do I have to be there for that? Well, go back to the definition of supervision. Like, you can't say, hey guys, here's like 50 orders. I'll be back in a couple of hours. That's not how it works. And we've had people in retail pharmacy that I think unfortunately thought, well, I'm going to have the technician, I'm going to give them a key. They can go open up, get the order, put the order up, prep all the prescriptions. And when I get there, I've got a whole line of stuff to check that they've already been filling. That's not how that works either. You know, can't take new prescriptions over the phone, can't take changes. I mean, it's fairly limited, and that's important to us that it's followed. So be sure you read that section thoroughly. Duties of the pharmacist, just as important. The ratio, man, we could have a couple of hours of argument over what a ratio should be, if one should or should not exist. But the fact is, there is a pharmacist to technician ratio in the state of Arkansas. It's strictly observed. And we're talking about technicians that are doing technician duties. So if you have a pharmacy technician, and I don't say this to denigrate anyone at all, but if you have a technician and part of their duties is they are, you know, dusting the shelves or sweeping the floors out front or straightening stock in the OTC area, I'm not counting that as technician duties. Like, they could straighten up the OTC section all day long. A lot of corporations, a lot of even independent pharmacies go ahead and get a tech permit for everybody, so that instead of working, like where I worked, we had a Hallmark card section. Well, hey, I understand that you really want to work on the gift section right now, but we're crazy busy. I need you to step back here and be a technician. When they step back and they're actually acting in technician duties, that's when the ratio really counts. Now to the longest rule ever. And it's actually shorter than it used to be. Yeah, I think it started at like 41 pages, got up to about 48, and then we were able to delete some stuff. A couple of these rules we've deleted like 2-3 pages in the last year. So when you have a pharmacy, and I actually had this question last week, well, what equipment do we have to have? Well, you have to have the equipment appropriate to what you are doing. Years ago, when I was in school, and I mean, this is something that I've changed from the board, you had specific equipment. You had to have graduated cylinders. You had to have an ointment slab. You had to have, you know, a torsion balance or a balance of some sort. And that got to be a problem, because some people thought if they had a torsion balance, they could compound anything. And that's not the same thing. Because there are a whole lot of torsion balances in pharmacies that will not balance for crap. Like, they will not work. You should not use them. So we got rid of the requirement to have it, because quite frankly, it was a little bit ridiculous. Hardly anybody was using them. Time requirements, that is important. We have a lot of people, whether it's time requirements for a pharmacist in charge in-state, out-of-state, or for a pharmacy itself to exist, it becomes fascinating, because, I mean, during COVID, we've had some issues where people say, we're just going to reduce our hours. Well, you have to be open 40 hours a week unless you have a waiver from the board. We have a handful of stores that have waivers from the board because they are in extremely rural areas. I mean, I grew up in Camden, Arkansas, the next town over, Bearden. It's like 17 miles from Bearden to the next pharmacy. So if you know where Bearden is, Bearden was able to ask for and get limited hours. You know, Portland, Arkansas, I don't think that place even has a stoplight, but it does a pharmacy, and they can work on less than 40 hours a week. But if you have a store in the middle of Little Rock, Arkansas, you're not going to get limited hours because you can't staff it. That's just not the way it works. It's not a competitive advantage issue. It's an area of shortage that you can actually apply and get that type of a waiver. We have people that don't want to meet the PIC requirements. And my statement is, if you don't want to meet the requirements to be a PIC, then don't be a PIC. Somebody has to work, you know, the prescribed number of hours in that store, and we see them as the person in charge of being sure that the staff is using whatever tools there are to help detect diversion in training, and make sure your staff is trained. What's funny, you see some rules like this all the way back to 1980 about vending machines. So I realize this dates me some, but coin-operated vending machines still exist. It does crack me up that they used to have cigarettes in them in places all over, which is, you know, I show that to my kids now, and they're like, they had cigarettes in vending machines? I was like, in every bar and pub and everything else you can imagine. But we still have people that want to use different types of automated dispensing cabinets. And I mean, I've had some requests even as of recent that they just want to put one in a building somewhere and go load it with prescriptions for people to come pick it up. And our state hasn't done that. Our state also has not allowed pharmacies without a pharmacist. There are several states that you could have a pharmacy with a technician, and as long as they can video conference in a pharmacist, it's fine. We haven't gone there. Cannot reuse drugs. And this is an interesting concept because some people think, well, if it's only been out of the pharmacy for like an hour, well, I could reuse that, right? Or, well, if so-and-so had these real expensive drugs and they're not going to be able to use them, can't I bring them back into a free clinic from their house? No. There are some very, very narrow instances where a long-term care facility, a nursing home, could donate unused drugs to a charity clinic. But we do not differentiate the safety of poor or indigent people being different from people who are not indigent. So it has to be safe enough for everyone to be safe enough for anyone, is the way that we've really looked at it in Arkansas. Pickup stations, that's worth knowing because we have had several instances where people were operating pickup stations, not realizing that they couldn't, and they're like, well, I've never seen a rule on that. Like, well, as you can see, there's been one around for, 42 years now. Well, where is it? It's under pickup stations. Well, how do I find it? I don't know how to help. I don't know if you're being serious right now. Emergency pharmacy services is an absolute. If you are working in a pharmacy, I've had pharmacists personally that have told me, well, I don't want to have to come up here in the middle of the night. Well, either give emergency services or post the sign. It's one or the other. And we've had pharmacies that would change ownership, or that they were a small box inside of a bigger box. They're like, well, I have patients that are moving in the nursing home and I want to be able to service them. Are you going to give emergency services? Well, I'd be willing to, but I can't get into the building at night. Then you can't service them. So we don't have a, well, I want to service all the convenient stuff for someone who's in an institutionalized setting, but I don't want to do the hard stuff. That's not how it works. Let's see what else. Always important to know who's responsible for what. Here's some more stuff on PIC. These actually outline some of the specific duties of a PIC. And I'll pause, and this is as much for you guys if you move out of state, or if you're in a pharmacy that ships to multiple states, just like anyone that reciprocates. When you accept the role of PIC, not just Arkansas, but other states, there are a lot of states that you are completely responsible for everything that happens in that pharmacy. And I could do a whole nother lecture on like just culture, but we have tried to move away from who is responsible and who has authority over whatever decision making might have contributed to a problem. And if you don't have the authority to change it in the pharmacy, even if you have the title PIC, then we're going to look at the permit holder, the actual business, rather than saying, well, you human, you didn't have the ability to make any change to such and such procedure, but you're the PIC, so it's your fault. Some states might still look at it as, well, you had your name as PIC, so that's your fault. That's a tough one for me. Got to have permit. Changes of ownership are always fascinating because everyone wants to always argue, well, is it really a change of ownership if we do it this way or that way? It's pretty clear. You've got 14 days to change it. If it's more than 20% of ownership, you've got to do a change of ownership. It's really not an application, it's more of a notification to us. You use the actual application, but you have a checkbox that it's a change of ownership, so we can leave your permit number the same. Got to do inventories. This is a state and federal issue. And I'll pause for a minute. When you talk about inventories, there's some idiocy and idiosyncrasies about things like inventories that people don't understand. When it lines out when you have to do it, but there's a whole lot of other times when you really should do it. There's some specifics as to you can estimate drugs, some drugs, whereas I would tell you you're an idiot if you estimate drugs. I used to do an exercise when I was straight out of pharmacy school. I worked at Tanglewood Drug here in Little Rock, so any of you that worked for Adam there, great guy. We hired him when I was there. And I'd take 3 or 4 different drugs out and put them on the counter, give everybody a Post-it note and say, guess how many, estimate how many are in each of these bottles. If we had a student on rotation, then I would have them count how many were each of like those 4 or 5 bottles, and then explain how the discrepancy between what 4 or 5 of us would guess in a true audit means we either somehow magically have extra drugs or missing drugs. So legally on the test, there are some you can estimate, but I would tell you in practicality, I will never estimate how many are in a container of controlled substance. Owners have to have the licensed pharmacist. We've had instances where that pops up because people say, I'm done with this place. I've quit next week. They don't have another pharmacist. They're telling me I have to come back to work. Like, you can quit a job. You don't have to listen. Like, you're not their prisoner. You're not their slave. If you quit and tell them you no longer work there, do your inventory and go. So it's their responsibility to have a pharmacist, not yours to cover everything they want you to. And some people don't like me saying that, but oh well. Got to know your security controlled substances. Do not have to know the fees. You do need to know the requirements for a new pharmacy permit. People, we had a call on this yesterday of, why are you making so-and-so wait 30 days to get a permit? Like, well, that's the rule. Well, why would you make them do that? And I'm like, well, we make everybody do that. And part of that is it gives us time to go through the paperwork, and we're going to inspect it before we actually issue a permit. Let's see. Like I said, longest rule ever. Central fill is fascinating. It's worth a read. We don't have a whole lot of that, but we have had some corporations that have taken advantage of central fill services. Offsite order entry is definitely worth reading about. It's fascinating because I think a lot of people think that offsite order entry means that they can just get people elsewhere to do the job rather than having employees on site. You can't use offsite order entry to dump employees. Now, don't tell Dr. Hilliard, I know she's retired from the college, but I'm not asking you about nuclear pharmacy, even though there's a nuclear pharmacy program here at this school, because it is an absolute rarity of practice. I cannot tell you the last time we had someone that was coming from another state. If you're doing nuclear pharmacy, you're already going to have certification in that. So you can skip that section for me. Specialty pharmacies are fascinating. We do have some methadone clinics that function in the state. We don't have any student health clinic pharmacies anymore. We do have some pilot programs. This is the only allowed occurrence of reuse of any type of drugs throughout the Board of Pharmacy rules. Out of state is worth reading. I've gotten a lot of flack over the years, and I get some of it, and that people think, well, out of state pharmacies have a completely different playing field. Well, there is a difference in, their PIC hours, but they have to have 1-800 numbers. They have to have pharmacists available. They have to be available 6 days a week, where we actually don't tell you that you have to be available 6 days a week in Arkansas. You just have to have a sign up for Patients About Emergency Services. There's another rule I'll show you in a little bit that's pretty fascinating for people that are shipping in meds. Got to know about hospital pharmacy, how they work, how their committees work. It is different in practice, but there are many things that are very similar. This is all still in the hospital side. Their offsite order entry for hospital is very specifically different. And some people want to intermingle them, or they are confused. So you do have to know what you can do retail versus what you have the ability to do for hospitals. Most of the hospital offsite order entry is to help do coverage and to do med checks and things overnight when the staff isn't at the hospital, because they have constant patient issues throughout the night. Charitable clinics do not have to be open 40 hours a week. I've had some people get confused over that before. There's the other rules about them procuring, dispensing donated medications. Still have to get medications from licensed sources. So Rule 5, nursing home consultants is what it kind of refers to, but it's really more about long-term care facilities. In the past, you had to have a specific endorsement, you had to pay an extra fee, and you had to have passed a test to be a nursing home consultant. And we got rid of all those aspects of that. We got rid of The endorsement for nursing home consultants, we got rid of the endorsement required for disease state management, which we'll see in Rule 9. And we got rid of having to have an endorsement to administer medications, immunizations, vaccines, or other injections for patients. It's interesting because every long-term care facility, every nursing home in the state of Arkansas has to have a pharmacy consultant. And you'll notice there's a difference between nursing homes and some of the institutional permits, like how often you have to go in and check stuff, because it's a big deal. And having some friends that have been in this area of practice for years, it's amazing how much of an impact a pharmacist can have trying to make sure that the patients in these settings have appropriate care. So it lays out what the specific responsibilities are, as well as what can be in emergency kits. It's important to note that in places like nursing homes, most of them may have a drug room, but most of the medications that are in that room are for specific patients. They can only have certain emergency medications, and they are actually, a pharmacy owns these medications and has them at the nursing home. So if something comes up missing, it's not the nursing home's drugs in these kits, it's the pharmacy's drugs. So especially controlled substances, they have very tight controls on how exactly they have to be processed in order for someone to be able to access the emergency kit. And it's limited formulary. Some states, they could have a whole pharmacy in there and nobody would even know about it. In Arkansas, it is not that way. It's truly meant for an emergency box, not just a convenience drug room. Same thing for hospice and emergency kits for crisis stabilization units, which we have 5 or 6 in the state. Shortest rule ever. This is actually, and I don't actually know exactly when this started because I have never done a change to Regulation 6 or Rule 6. It literally is a paragraph to show you that if you have a license, we are going to mail you a copy of any type of order that we have for you. If you act like you don't receive it, I can't help that. I'm going to show proof that we mailed it to you. If you don't show up to the hearing, we will still be able to have a hearing against you, but it's basically telling you kind of how that process works. One thing, not on the test, but so that you know it, because I've had people get mad about this before, if we are giving you an order or notice of hearing, we have to tell you what potential punishment there could be. And potential punishment for any violation is the full gamut from nothing to revocation. And you have people like, I missed 2 hours of CE. How could you dare say that my license could be revoked? And I'm trying to tell you, I'm not suggesting your license should be revoked, but legally I have to tell you that it could be revoked. So whenever you get something, some of you will, some of your classmates will, and they're going to freak out. Some people have no experience dealing with the Board of Pharmacy, and they will give you terrible advice about what's going on. I think that our board is fairly unique in that if you call our board, a human answers the phone, and you can usually talk to a pharmacist unless we are all tied up in a hearing or a meeting or something like that. Drugs and prescriptions. This gets interesting, especially today, because we're going to talk some about compounding throughout this, in that people, I guess people just use prescription drug, prescription order, and they think they all mean the same thing, and they don't. So there are instances in our rules where it says, compounding prescriptions, and it's meaning for an actual prescription, not just compounding drugs. Some of the veterinary language that we're working on, it should be updated by the end of next month, lays that out a little bit. So it talks about therapeutic equivalents, which is different than generic equivalents. This is actually newer language that we have in the state of Arkansas. You can still get fax orders, phone orders. It's important to know who can do those. Transfers, it's important to know how transfers work. Each state is different. There are some where only pharmacists can be involved in transfers. There are some states where if someone calls you for a transfer, you have to give it to them. We do not have that rule in Arkansas. We have Arkansas pharmacies that at times will get a call from out of state. People say, it's illegal for you to refuse to give me a transfer. And they're like, hold on a minute. Call the Board of Pharmacy and are like, no, it's not illegal for you to refuse a transfer. But if somebody's really trying to leave you, what do you really want them? And most of the time it's pharmacists wanting to call the patient to make sure they actually are wanting to move their meds rather than just some cold call, which should not happen. I'll get to that here in a minute. because someone has slammed their prescriptions and are trying to steal their business. It's still fascinating. We have this, signing of prescriptions. You either sign the prescription or you sign a daily log. And daily log is talked about elsewhere. If you use an electronic prescription process, must fill prescription in accordance with this other rule. I get this question on controlled substances, and regardless of what the rule says, anytime I fill a controlled substance prescription, and I advise, my spouse, my friends, I sign it across the face of it. I cancel it. You have some people say, well, that ruins the prescription. I'm like, ruins the prescription? You just filled it. You got to cancel this thing. I have seen instances where people want to sign just barely in the corner or along the edge of a prescription. Someone else steals the actual hard copy, cuts off the signature, and goes and fills it somewhere else. So when I say cancel it, I mean like cancel it. Make it to where it's obvious it's been filled. How long you got to keep all your records is always important. Generic substitution is a very direct statement relating to Orange Book. Where that gets interesting is there are a few drugs that are not in Orange Book because it is a generic made under approval from the brand name, and it's actually the same drug. There's been a major like federal lawsuit over EpiPen and epinephrine auto injectors were both made by the same company, and one was half the price of the other. Same drug, but it wasn't technically generically equivalent. So a lot of plans would only let you run through the generic, but then might argue that you inappropriately substituted it or some idiocy like that. We straightened that out. A lot of those are in the X-rated because they're actually an approved drug from the manufacturer. So we said it's actually not even generic substitution, it's the same drug. So we do not have state HIPAA, but we do have patient confidentiality. And we have had people in the past that have struggled with that. I don't know why, but I will warn you that if you think it's funny to get on Facebook and claim that some, I don't know, ex-boyfriend or ex-girlfriend had a STD, first of all, that probably means you did too. Second of all, if they did and you think you're being funny, people think you have just disclosed private health information because you're a pharmacist. So don't do that. I don't know what else to say. I've had to deal with that a couple of times. I'm like, that's stupid. You're making fun that they had chlamydia? Doesn't that mean you probably have chlamydia? I don't know. I wouldn't advertise that. Or so-and-so, my favorite is they got herpes. I'm like, you can't wash that off. Like, that sticks around forever. Therapeutic substitution. Therapeutic substitution, there are only a couple of states in the whole country that have therapeutic substitution in reality, and I like to think that Arkansas is a leader in this. Very similar to generic substitution, if the prescriber says you cannot substitute it, you cannot substitute it. If the patient says you cannot substitute it, you cannot substitute it. If you're trying to substitute it to something that costs more money, you can't do it. So it's only to have an equivalent or a savings for a patient. If they're equivalent and only one's available, the other one's not, you can switch it. If the patient really feels like they want, drug A instead of drug B, then there's not a prohibition, you can do that. We see this a lot with some of the insulin products that were not necessarily deemed equivalent when they were made biologics. Who knew they were biologics? We've been using different cell media to grow that stuff for years, but there's several different insulin glargines that aren't necessarily equivalent in the now purple book for biologics. But if insurance will only pay for this kind of quote unquote generic or biosimilar or whatever, you could go have that discussion with the patient. You put it in the system so the prescriber will also see it and you could substitute that. And we try to educate prescribers. You do not want it substituted. Absolutely do not. Then put do not substitute there on the prescription. Compounding, you need to read this whole section. I understand that a lot of you may not do compounding in practice, and you may never do compounding in practice, but I'm going to make you show that you have a working knowledge of some of these issues with compounding. We see a lot of compounding that is an absolute violation of what we perceive federal rules to be, or federal regulations, as well as our rules. You can't just, as a pharmacy, compound and duplicate commercially available products. We have a lot of places right now, they're like, well, it's not the same as the commercial product because this product also has B12 in it. Okay, does the patient have a documented need for B12 on top of this other injectable from the prescriber? Well, not exactly. Well, then why are you doing that? Or I need it in a different concentration. I understand if you have to have something like extremely concentrated for a small injection or something, but some of it we'll see is less concentrated. It makes no sense. The FDA says that simple concentration differences, especially if it's 20% different, that's not an excuse to make a commercially available or duplicated commercially available product. Pharmacist has to oversee all that too. I literally had somebody this week that sent me a question asking, it was actually on outsourcing facility, I understand that they have to have a license. Do they have to have an Arkansas registered pharmacist? And they had screenshotted the rule, and number 5 on the rule literally says like you have to have an Arkansas licensed pharmacist. And I'm like, I think you're being serious, but in case you missed it, you already sent me the rule that says this. Got to know good compounding practices. I don't think I have anything on drug samples. You got to know controlled substances. And in this, not just do you have to know controlled substances, you've got to know about emergency prescriptions. You've got to know who can do what with controlled substances. And you also have to know what schedule drugs are in. If you don't know that a benzodiazepine is a Schedule 4, if you don't know that a hydrocodone of such and such type is a Schedule 2, then you don't know who can and cannot do it. You don't know what rules follow it if you don't know what schedule it is. So those are both very important to us. Partial filling is important to us. Got to keep your records. You've absolutely got to know how theft or loss of controlled drugs works. There's a whole section, if you go to the FAQ, how do I, that explains what you have to do in the event that you have a controlled substance loss. Got to know about methamphetamine precursors, which is right here in 07040008. Arkansas used to have the arguable title of meth cooking capital of the world. Not necessarily that we had the most meth, but we had the most people trying to cook meth. We were in a neck and neck race with Missouri for several years on that. And while we don't see nearly as much of it now, because it's usually not larger scale, it's usually small scale single bottles, but we still, we had a horrific issue of methamphetamine. In fact, Arkansas Children's Hospital for many years, most of their burn unit was basically occupied by either adults or children that were burned in meth lab accidents. So this at the end is new as of this year and is very fascinating, and maybe whether it's on the test or not, it's fascinating because if you have loved ones, if you're working for a pharmacy that ships prescriptions, if you're dealing with out-of-state pharmacy services that are shipping in, you should not ever have anybody at this point that at random goes home one day and has drugs on their porch they didn't know were getting there. We had that happen. We actually had some legislative leaders that had this happen like to them and their family, and they were very incensed by the fact that someone got my information, billed my insurance, and shipped me a prescription, and I didn't get counseling, I didn't get notified, I didn't know it was coming or anything else. One of the more important things to me on this that could impact all of us, even working in any pharmacy in Arkansas, is if they have a plan to get you your meds and there's an ice storm or there's a, the bridge goes out at Memphis again or something happens and they can't get it to you, they have to have a plan for you to be able to get that medication locally. So what I anticipate with this is we're going to have instances where a pharmacy provider elsewhere might call your pharmacy, say, I need to transfer a prescription to you, and I need to see if I can get 5 days of this prescription for this patient. Is that a question, or we got a mic messed up? Okay, I'll keep going. So that's important to know. 8, here's the good news. That's 20 pages. I'm not going to ask you, if you read through this one time, you should probably be fine with wholesale distributors. The important thing that you have to know is you have to buy from licensed sources. We have had wholesalers, we've had programs that are kind of like the eBay of drugs for pharmacy to pharmacy. If you have people in another state trying to buy something from your store and you ship it to them thinking, oh, I'm just going to ship a couple of antibiotics to them, there are some states, they see that as criminal activity. Like, they will prosecute you, generally for misdemeanors, but criminally, for shipping to that state without a permit. At the same time, if you are buying from other states, other suppliers, it's easy to find on the Board of Pharmacy website. Make sure they have a legal permit to ship into the state of Arkansas. Because if they don't, I can't help you if you get an audit on that. It's like, oh, well, they said they bought it from such company. They did not have an active license in Arkansas, so you didn't obtain the drugs legally. That's not going to end well for any of us. I can't help you with that. So you got to have a permit. That's most of it. There's some minimum qualifications that are interesting to read. You also have medical equipment, which would be like DME equipment. That is worth reading. Because many pharmacies actually use their pharmacy permit to do home medical equipment or DME equipment. And there are standalone businesses that do not have a pharmacy permit that instead get this DME permit to sell this stuff. You got to have a license to do it if you're billing it direct to patients. List 1 chemicals. What are list 1 chemicals? Methamphetamine precursors. There you go. We used to have a lot of list 1 chemical wholesalers in the state of Arkansas until we changed all of our pseudoephedrine, ephedrine, phenylpropanolamine rules, and they all basically went away. There's some really fascinating cases, 15 to 20 years ago with the board on that. 9, patient counseling. All right, I'm going to ask the room, is patient counseling required on new prescriptions? Are you sure? All right, that's a good answer. You read it says shall. Shall is an operative word that is yes. We have a lot of people that think if I sign that little pad over there, that patient waived counseling. It doesn't say unless the patient waives counseling, it says you shall counsel. So if your defense before the board is, I know I made a med error and it was a new prescription, but the patient signed the pad, that doesn't matter. If you did not counsel them and you were the pharmacist responsible for it, those aren't great conversations. It's important to know what patient counseling is that's required. Point of care treatment is really an interesting, new section of this rule. This rule actually used to be much longer with all the idiotic sub rules for things like disease state management or for immunizations or anything else. Point of care therapy is brand new. I mean, you are in the absolute, first generation of pharmacists that will come out of school already able to do this versus all of the rest of us came through hearing that someday this will happen. Well, it's happened. We have pharmacies right now. I had an instance a couple of weeks ago that, they were doing test and treat for influenza and, had a household exposure, were able to use the protocol. I'll show that to you on the board website, and able to treat the rest of the family due to flu exposure. Right now it's influenza, strep A, pharyngitis caused by strep A, and then SARS coronavirus. And at some point in the future, we could add other things, but we have to do it by rule. Support group. This is a rule that is well worth reading. I don't know that any of you have ever heard any of my stories about support group. When I was in pharmacy school, we actually had SOS, Student Outreach Services, trying to help with students that struggled with whether it was mental issues, alcohol, drugs, emotional issues, or anything else, and just trying to be someone that it's like, hey, if nothing else, here are some students that are absolutely willing to talk to you about this. I can tell you that I did my first intervention on one of my best friends when I was a pharmacy student involved with SOS. Since that time, I've done a lot more interventions. My interventions are a little bit different than what you might hear about in your addiction class, because most often my interventions are, we have caught you doing all of this stuff and you can either surrender your license or you can go into a voluntary preliminary consent order and we're going to send you to a rehab facility. And I want to be very clear, and I'm glad that this is something that other people have to listen to if they're trying to study for our test. I consider, and my whole board does, that, you know, addictive disease is a disease. These use disorders are diseases, and that there is a way to recover from them. The other thing I will tell you though is, you know, my pharmacy school class, there were 75 of us, and within about 5 years of me being at the board, I was at the board within a couple years, 2.5 years after I graduated. In 5 years, I'd already taken the license of 4 of my classmates. And while 2 of them are successfully practicing pharmacists at this point, one of them will probably never practice pharmacy again. They had a chance to, but because of their felony convictions and some other business opportunities, they probably never will. And then one of my best friends from college and pharmacy school did a permanent surrender. And that was the first intervention I ever did, as well as a future second one, and then later a third incident that, you know, they just can't work around prescription drugs. So I'll tell you, you are going to deal with people that are addicted to alcohol or drugs in this class. You're going to deal with it at work. You're probably going to deal with it some in your own family. And if you think that it doesn't exist there, or if you think it's funny, you hadn't looked around very hard. Because I guarantee you, I know 3 or 4 friends right now today that aren't in recovery that probably should be. But the other thing I'll tell you with that is, if you know anybody that is struggling with that, I'd much rather them get help before it becomes an issue in their work and an issue where the Board of Pharmacy has to be involved. As you guys have your addictive course or your addiction course, you know, be the friend that's willing to go to an open meeting. And I'll tell you, you know, I still go to open meetings with some of my friends. I've had people that say, I really want to go to a meeting. I'll say, hey, I'll go with you. I have friends now that invite me when they have birthday celebrations, and those meetings are generally a lot of fun anyway, because those people are hilarious. Like, I might be funny, they're funny, because they will tell you all the wreckage and how they wish they hadn't done it. All right, criminal background checks. Yes, you have to do a criminal background check. You have to do a criminal background check when you switch from being a technician to an intern, or when you switch from being an intern to a pharmacist. This is oftentimes the hardest step for people to get by to get a registration with the Board of Pharmacy, because some people just cannot remember being arrested or convicted or having spent time in prison, and they have been forgiven of it and have therefore forgotten it. We have had people that say, I mean, we had one, just a couple months ago that, nope, they weren't here to discuss any of their criminal history. They weren't doing that. And the board said, that's just fine. We will deny your application at this point. So if you are in the future dealing with trying to hire employees and they've had some application with the Board of Pharmacy and it's been like 2 months, it does not take us 2 months to process anybody's paperwork unless there's an issue, and is most likely this, but we can't tell you. So ask them what paperwork they might have gotten from the Board of Pharmacy, or any feedback, or if they've got to come meet with us, or whatever is going on with that. Last one, automation, and it's pretty easy. It's basically saying that if you're trying to use some sort of robotic or automated system, so how many of you guys work in a pharmacy that actually has like a robot? Bunch of you guys. Nobody in Northwest working with robots? All right, there we got a couple. Make sure you're alive up there. Can't see Harding, but I'm sure there's some there as well. So all of those robots, those Paradas, those Script Pros, all those machines, when they first came to the state, like, we would actually have staff go and look and evaluate and make sure that they were functioning as they were supposed to. But we've had a couple of instances, and we had one recently where we have an inspector go in a place and there's a robot cranking out scripts, and it's like slinging pills out of itself. Like, if it can't get the pills in the bottle, like, all the time, and there's, 100 pills laying around in it, like, you guys need to shut this down and fix it, because this is not going to work. But we have, I've got people right now asking about things like drones. I have people that want, like, oh, there's something else. Something sounded goofy to me, but I mean, dispensing machines just on the side of buildings and stuff that aren't even pharmacies. We don't go for that. So a couple of things I'm going to show you. I'm going to back up to our main page. There's some related forms in the law book section you can look at, but I also want to show you overview of prescribing authority. We did this a few years ago because it has gotten incredibly more complex as of late. You need to study this. You don't just need to study this for the test. You need to study this for your practice, because what I can tell you is you have a law course and you have a law exam. You are in these 2 colleges of pharmacy in the state of Arkansas. This is the only state in the country that you have to pass your jurisprudence exam to practice in Arkansas before you graduate. Everywhere else, you graduate and then they go it costs you a couple $100 to take it for every other state, like $250 or $275. Med school has no law course. Nursing school, no law course. Some veterinary schools actually have a law course, and they actually have a law test they have to pass and do a law review for veterinarians to get licensed in Arkansas. Nobody else has this. So I can tell you that I have firsthand, even in my current role with the Board of Pharmacy, had to educate prescribers that this, what is on this, is the limit to their scope of practice, not what they think they heard from their friend who also has a license and got away with it. So that's it, you know. It's pretty straightforward, I think. There's one thing that we expect to change in the future, like physician assistants. They have a rule that says the name of the supervising physician has to be on any prescription for controlled substances. But they're going to delete that rule. So they're going to, but it hasn't happened yet. So for purposes of this test, their current rule states this, and that's the way that we would interpret it. I think it'll be 4 to 6 months, it'll probably change. We also have statewide protocols for, there's one for naloxone that basically can lay out that if you are someone that could be at risk or may come in contact with someone at risk for an opioid overdose, you can use this protocol and the pharmacist can act as the prescriber and sell you naloxone. And basically everybody is either potentially at risk or could come in contact with someone at risk for an opioid overdose. I have friends that unexpectedly, you know, would come across somebody in an opioid overdose places you would never think, you know, at a basketball or football game or driving down the road. I have a friend that car in front of her is like all of a sudden kind of rolling off. Finally, somebody rolls up and checks on it and they open the door and the lady falls out of it. The car's about to roll over and she's in an opioid overdose. They called 911, got an ambulance there, and it was, you know, a full-blown overdose. The other ones for influenza, strep, a little more organized of how you have to do this, how you have to go through the questionnaire to see if someone is eligible for being treated. Forms you have to fill out, got to keep all your records for 2 years. There's another one for oral contraceptives. We don't have it on our website because you have to go through a training program in order to take advantage of it. That's the state law requires it. So we're not going to put it out here and have someone that hasn't gone through the training program just start using it. So we're an hour in. What questions do you guys have? I'll unmute that. Thank you. Because it blocked like 2 hours for this.
I have a question. It's about pickup stations and if delivering curbside is considered a pickup station.
Like at the pharmacy curbside?
Yeah.
That is not considered a pickup station. If you deliver directly to a patient, whether it's at the pharmacy or at their home, or we have some places that will even deliver, they'll have a group of people in a business office and like 3 of them get their prescriptions and they'll go deliver it to your work, and they may even be delivering to people. If you're handing it directly to the patient or to their caregiver, that's not a pickup station. Pickup station, if you look at the definition, is literally I'm taking medication somewhere else for a patient to come later and pick up, and it's specifically for a medical clinic with a prescriber that's more than 10 miles from another pharmacy. We have had issues where people wanted to use a dialysis center as a pickup station because they're there to get dialysis and they have other dialysate products or related vitamin stuff that they have to get therapy for, but you can't just get all your drugs and say, I'll just pick them up at the dialysis center, because it's not a pharmacy. What else you got?
John, we have a question.
Yes, sir.
Hey, I was just wondering about our state exam. If you guys would call the same day after the exam. I don't remember what you said.
It really depends on how quickly we can get the exams back to our office and processed. Because it's Scantron, it's usually really quick, but we have one person that's going to come back from Fayetteville, and it may be an overnight issue, depending on what else we have to go there. So it may not be able to grade that test until the following day. So it's usually within the first couple of days after the test. May not be same day.
Thank you.
What else you guys got? Might help you on the test if you ask now. I got to have a Northwest question too.
I have a question over here.
All right.
How long do we have to take the exam?
Oh, that's a good question. We give an hour and a half for the test. Some people would use whatever amount of time we would give you, but I would say the average people are usually done within an hour. Like usually when we give an hour and a half, you know, there's like, you all have that classmate, I had them, that if we said 4 hours, they would be here for 3 hours and 59 minutes and I'd have to threaten them to take the test, but most people are done within an hour. I mean, it's Scantron. You either know it or you don't. And I will say that did key off another thing for me. I will tell you this, and I tell every reciprocity group this as well. When you take this test, you read the question, you answer the question, you move on. If you go back and change a bunch of answers, you double your chance of getting it wrong. I mean, every person, you know, Nancy Sweet at our office who handles a bunch of the testing, especially reciprocity, when we see someone that fails the test, 70% is passing, but it's just pass fail. Like, don't come and go, well, what did I make? If you failed, it was less than a 70. If you passed, it was more than a 70. But I mean, just so you know, my benchmark is 70%. But people that go back and change a whole bunch of answers, unless you see it like a true false, I mean, the first whole section is true false. So if you love true false, that's great. There's a whole section. If you hate them, they're worth like 3/4 of a point apiece. So they're not heavily weighted questions. So that's good or bad. Answer it and keep going, because if you change a bunch of stuff, you're going to screw up.
I have a question.
Sure.
So is this going to be like a paper exam that's given to us and then we have the Scantron as well? Or is this going to be like, okay.
It is a test where we will bring packets of tests. You will have to put your name on it, and we will match up to make sure we've got everybody's test. And we only grade the Scantron. So the other thing I tell people, you can write all over that test. You can draw me pictures. I've had people do caricatures before, or draw me, this is my dog. I wish I was with my dog right now. You know, this test really sucks. I'm like, yes, it does. I've taken it. I take it at least once a year. I took it this morning. But you can write all over the test, but like, you don't need a calculator. You shouldn't need a calculator. It's not a math test, but we only grade what's on the Scantron. So when we've had people that just get to the back page of the test and they just forget to fill out the Scantron. I'm like, boy, you failed that one nicely. And I'm like, oh, well, it's because you didn't even finish it. So be sure you put all your answers on there. What else?
I had a question.
Sure.
Right here.
Yes.
Right here. I was wondering, where in the regs can we find the scope of practice for interns?
In Rule 2. So interns, it doesn't necessarily say that. Her question, if you couldn't hear it the other cameras, where can you find the scope of practice for interns? The interesting thing is interns can do most everything a pharmacist can do under supervision. And it's not clearly stated that they can do this and they can do this. Like, it doesn't say an intern can give shots, although we have it elsewhere that if they're trained, they can give shots, but everything's under supervision. The easier thing to rule out is what interns cannot do. Interns can't be the final check. Interns can't work alone, even if you're a graduate intern. So, and this is probably going to sound nuts to you guys, but when we got out of pharmacy school, I think it was the same for you, if I was in phone contact with a pharmacist, I could work by myself before I ever took Naplex. And that is stupid. I thought that was great. I mean, my wife was already a pharmacist. If I could call her, I could work by myself. I cannot believe I did that. So we had a case at the Board of Pharmacy that a graduate intern, which now doesn't count in your ratio, but has to have a pharmacist with them, there was a major med error, and none of us in my office, it was right before I started at the board in 2004, I don't think any of us thought that the graduate intern was actually the one that made the mistake. We think that someone else did it under their name. But because it was under their name and she signed the daily log, because she was responsible for everything under her name, she wound up on the stand in court basically having to answer, so you mean to tell me that you have not passed the minimum qualification test for anyone in the United States to be a pharmacist, but you were acting as one? I was like, oh, that's bad. Like, that's really bad. But we had some corporations even when we went and surveyed the other states thought we were joking when we said we'd been doing it, and it'd been going in Arkansas for like 40 years. But it went back to, in the 1970s, even before there was a PharmD around. Well, you graduated and you had to work as an intern for most of the next year to get your hours, because you didn't get them during school to get licensed at that point. So, but yeah, you can do, if you are working with a pharmacist and they're confident in your ability to counsel patients and they're in eyesight earshot to back you up, make sure you don't say something crazy or stupid or off base, you can counsel patients. You could take prescriptions over the phone. You can act and fill them. But you can't be the final check on it is the biggest thing. You've got to have somebody responsible for you backing you up.
I have a question.
Sure.
So building on that, our technician licenses are expiring, and before they're always telling us that you should keep both because the pharmacist and the ratio and all that. I'm kind of letting mine expire because I don't really need it. I'm going to be an intern, but is there any reason to keep it?
The only reason, and for anybody that didn't hear it, she's asking about, she also has a tech permit, wondering if she should keep it. The only reason is if you are trying to work somewhere and you know that for ratio purposes, you're going to have to be a tech and limited to tech duties, that's the only reason to have a tech permit. If I probably had a couple of times, like on a Saturday, where if I was working and I had 2 interns, I had to make sure one of them could be a tech and have a tech permit and do tech duties, because I couldn't supervise 2 paid interns at a time. But if you're on rotation, we don't count the intern on a school assigned rotation in the ratio.
Yeah, I was going to get you on that technicality. So, we're going to be P4, so we won't need a tech license ever, technically.
If you are on a rotation.
Correct, yes.
Yeah, I loved having P4 students on the job getting paid. They counted in my ratio, but they're the best trained folks we had. What else?
So for this test purpose, I'm right here. For this test purpose, we have to know the details of the flu and strep protocol.
Not down to the specifics of the point of care protocol. Like you have to know that your point of care testing works, but I'm not going to ask you, I'm not going to ask you the clinical question of, well, if the patient does this, this, and this, because I always argue with that stuff. Like I had somebody, there was a training thing and it was talking about for oral contraceptives. I went through that and they're like, well, this person is 28 years old and she smokes a pack of cigarettes a day. I'm like, I'm not giving her birth control, or at least I'm not giving her any estrogen containing birth control because I'm not risking a blood clot. And they're like, well, actually, because of their age, I'm like, nope. So there are points even of what you can do, and that's probably a good point. Just because you can do, shots, there's some people that have absolute needle phobias and they're not going to be given any immunizations. And they're just going to find a job where that works for them. If you don't want to use the influenza protocol on somebody, you don't have to use it. It's something that you can use. It's a present that you can use, but it's not that we're not making pharmacists do it. Anybody else? All right. Thanks, guys. See you in a couple weeks.